Hello, everybody. Welcome. It's a pretty blustery day, but I have my windscreen on, and I have tested it, and it's not perfect, but it doesn't interfere too much with my prosody or vocal music, and so should be in good shape given the wind. Lots of things on my mind. As many of you know, I follow the UFO topic, which I'm going to keep calling UFO. I think I've just made that decision. I understand the difference between the word flying and the word aerial. So, unidentified aerial phenomena or phenomenon. And unidentified flying object. When we form words about situations, events, what we conceive of as entities or discriminable elements, parts, wholes, and this is pretty left hemispheric language because the intelligence that's involved in abstract analysis is prone to dissection. And it's been pruning our category trees in the same way that if in a cartoon universe, so that no one gets hurt, adults were ignorant enough so they'd have human children, but they'd always prune off the limbs except for the head because those are just extraneous and you don't need those. We often find ourselves in a situation similar to that in the cognitive and linguistic habits we become infected with in childhood. And it's not all bad, but the stuff that's bad is so bad that it doesn't really matter that it's not all bad, right? One can claim that getting an infection is useful because it strengthens your immune system. But if it produces sepsis or, disposes of your organs, the idea that it, isn't all bad is unhelpful at that point, right? So we, along with English or French or German, and probably along with any language, to some degree, there come, during acquisition, there are, what do you call this? They're devastatingly stupidifying and blinding games are smuggled into our linguistic and thought habits. They come along with the languages. The languages themselves, I could make arguments that English is the result of modern English that I speak. Is a utilitarian disease forged by colonial industrialists and warmongers and so on. Grabists, we might call them. Even though they weren't only grabists, but yeah, they were pretty much grab up everything, kill anyone who gets in the way that you can get away with, and just get the money, get the land, get the resources. So, in English we have a good example of one of these diseases is the concept that is smuggled in under the rubric, right, by stealing authority from Darwin. And this is really the wrong kind of theft, in which the phrase survival of the fittest is weaponized and used as justification for genocide, omnicide, environmental rape, pillaging, burning down the history and future of life on Earth, and your mom and your daughter, right, and anybody else who manages to come close to the machinery. They just get sucked in and ground up and it spits out little packets of dead shit. If you'll forgive me for being blunt, which I feel like being today. So, each of the languages, the language is like a ship, and the ship contains not merely words for things and entities, but hidden, it contains the purposes for which we decide to collapse the manifold of the actual infinite identity of anything we look at to a deliverable extremely drunken white boys. Drunken enough to pose a threat, actually. All right, so what gets smuggled in are the purposes for which we collapse the everythings and experience into deliverable derivations in language. And this is never done for no purpose. It's always done for a specific purpose. And the purposive drivers, the purposive motivations that underlie modern English as a whole, the tree of motivations is very broad. And includes such things as poetry and literature and schizophrenic garble and all kinds of things, right? But the central trunk of this tree is structured by purposes that are largely malignant. So if we go back to the phrase acquired at least as an interpretation of Darwin's theory, even if he didn't specifically say these words in this sequence, survival of the fittest, it's a snippet, right? Obviously, Darwin never writes the sentence, the incomplete sentence, survival of the fittest. The concept arises in some milieu, but is taken in English to basically mean to grant carte blanche for the most disembodied, malignant forms of defection from being human. And I will argue that industry, war, prisoneering, these are defections. These are catastrophic defections on the part of our species, particularly at the level where it forms groups. whatever Darwin might have been thinking about, and the reasons Darwin was thinking toward the issues of the origins of species and speciation and mutation and so forth. And he got the mutation thing right. The origin thing, not right. But the reasons he was thinking is that he was trying to read the book of nature and understand what principles could be observed there. Now, as someone that constantly sees competition and experiences competition as a human being, competition as humans usually practice it, which is fairly weird in nature, by the way, in my view, he must have been influenced by that seeing. And I strongly suspect that Darwin saw far more than he published, as is true of probably every scientist that ever published anything. But Darwin was unaware of features of biology such as endosymbiosis. I'm not sure how much he knew about cells. This is my own ignorance, not his. But had Darwin been aware, for example, that the components, what we think of anyway, as the primary components of the eukaryotic cell are adoptees, right? Previously distinct adoptees. And one way of viewing that is a beautifully commensal symbiotic communion, right? But another way of viewing it is the cell was consuming these external organisms, quote unquote external, right? Organisms in its environment, and then failed to digest some of them, or something like this, and they became organs in future cells, capable of transmitting their lineage along with the DNA packet of the oocytes and spermatozoa and the fertility cells of animals, eukaryotes, right? Which is hilariously a bit. This is one of those words in English that has strange homonymy, or because it's literally you carry oats, right? You have oats in you. You carry oats. Now, most people would think that's accidental and comedic. I'm not so schizophrenic that I think there's no part of it that's accidental. But the idea that it's entirely an accident, right? It's an absolute accident, meaningless. No chance of that being true. That's simply not how humans forge languages. They don't do it that way. They're incapable. How could you produce a token whose structure was entirely accidental? Think of it as a mathematical task, right? It would be similar to producing, all of the words would have had to have been produced entirely randomly for there to be no relation, as my second grade teacher told me, between the word S-E-E, seeing, to see, and the word S-E-A, also see in English. And when I asked her, there's certainly a relationship here, right? She said, no, absolutely not. It's entirely arbitrary. And I was like, I don't think that's possible for anything to be entirely arbitrary. Certainly not things that humans make. How could you succeed at perfectly excluding intention and meaning? How would you do that, right? It's like the task of, imagine you have scientists and they're in a laboratory. And they're trying to prove, or rather, to present evidence for the possibility of the arbitrary emergence of life on Earth. Because either A, it was some kind of rich prebiotic soup in the beginning, or B, accidents of sudden transformation, if you just put heat and water together under certain conditions, lightning strikes, meteor strikes, lots of disturbance, sudden shocking disturbances can transform a thing from one state into another. I think both of those ideas are wildly unlikely. However, my point is that imagine you're a researcher and you're trying to do experiments to produce supportive evidence for one of these theories. The sudden, accidental emergence of life on Earth, arbitrary, no intelligence is involved. Or, a transformer theory where you have all this stuff, accidents of geotectonic or geophysical situation produce life. Again, no intelligence involved, right? Because for some strange reason, the goal of science has for some time, and this should never be true. This is completely fucking wrong. The goal of science has been for some time to completely exclude the possibility of any overseeing intelligence, and also to claim in one of the strangest moves of science in all of scientific history that as there is no evidence, I'm going to get back to that idea in a minute, for other intelligences, we have proven that it is impossible via the proof of we haven't found any evidence. Wow, I just saw a hawk scan a gopher aerially and then take the gopher. That's pretty crazy. I mean, intense. Makes me think about the difference between what's actually going on and Darren making face noises.
Yeah, would you like to stick around here for a little bit, get food, catch the 6 o'clock train? Yeah. I just want fresh.
So science, and really it's not science, it's a specific cohort of scientists that comprise mainstream branches of the tree, and particularly academic branches. It turns out that scientists themselves and public academia as well are prone to catch doctrinal diseases. Diseases such as, we shall in all theories and cases treat the universe as if everything is accidental, mechanical, that the material is the only thing that's actually true and matters, and we shall evacuate space-time itself, as well as all distances between entities. We will evacuate those two places. We will put nothing there. Absolutely nothing. Other than physical, transmissible signals. We will evacuate all of that, and we will make our theories according to this. This is effectively like if you... Imagine that it was possible to dissect our eyes but still retain some semblance of vision. And so the scientists decide to throw, 87% of what can be seen away, thinking that, we've done away with nonsense, now we can get on with the real work. And then started forming theories about the remainder. Always presuming, no matter what they might find, that the 87% they've excluded was correctly excluded. From a position of nascent blindness in the beginning, right? You've already put on the blinders, now you're going to dissect your eyes to make sure you can't take them off. And go ahead, keep publishing research, see how that goes. Even if your research is relatively functionally reliable, right, reproducible, you're still missing all the key features that would help you to understand the phenomena you're studying, naturally, because those lie in the excluded no man's land of what if consciousness is pervasive? What if consciousness is fundamental? What if something similar to consciousness but more advanced is fundamental, which is what I would argue. At least fundamental in this reference frame of physical time-space. What's fundamental is probably transsentience, which is a multimodal placeholder for unimaginably sophisticated superpositions over individual minds and thought and theory and so forth. I'm open to other perspectives as well. It's the kind of question where you don't want to be led or blinded by your biases, but I've seen the face of the transcendent in nature and in consciousness, and I recognize its fingerprint now, having sort of eaten of the apple, so to speak, and I can see that fingerprint everywhere around me, including in the way that I form the language that I'm using now. So there is a superposition above minds. Turns out that the watchmaker's argument, perhaps floated by Francis Bacon, I can't remember who floated it, which is the argument Dawkins specifically attacked in The Blind Watchmaker. Maybe his second book ever. The argument that, if you find something super sophisticated, it's obvious the mind made it. Well, let's go back to a specific irony. And the question of whether it's possible to compose a word whose structure and sounds are totally arbitrary. Even if you tried to do it with a machine, you would fail because there's no such thing as an actually random number. And if you're using a machine to produce the word, the machine was made by humans. So you necessarily, unavoidably, explicitly, unavoidably inherit, in this case, sorry, I don't mean to browbeat you, you inherit the human's thought, history, consciousness, purposes in building the machine, and those cannot be excluded from the produce of any operation of that machine. Therefore, it is impossible to produce a word. You have to have the human intent to produce a word, right? You can't have no intention and then build a machine with no intentions whatsoever, none, zero, and then cause that machine with no intention to produce a word. There's no way to do it. You couldn't. And you have a similar problem in the attempts of strangely confused biologists to produce life in the lab. as you know, for the sake of supporting the theories of what I will call a sentient, like a sentient biosis, right? A sentient biosis, meaning life arises on a world without the intrusion, influence, or intentional manipulation of any form of mind-like beings. So, you have the same problem in the lab you have with the word. Humans make laboratories. Humans devise experiments. How will you produce an experiment that demonstrates that that life arises without the intervention of intelligences when you are an intelligence attempting to prove that? You can't subtract the influence of human motive, intention, history, so forth, assembling the experiment, measuring the results. It's all done by humans or machines that humans made, and then it's interpreted by humans. So there's no way to compose an experiment that actually provides evidence for a sentient biosis. Nonetheless, many humans will continue their careers attempting to do so. The vast preponderance of evidence, theoretical and mathematical, is fundamentally against the core narrative of materialist science. Research, thought, opinion, belief, and so forth. The search space over which you'd have to resolve unimaginably sophisticated problems is so catastrophic that you might as well think of that search space as being a form of probabilistic anti-lightning, right? You need to have 9 billion lightning strikes at the same spot over 10 seconds to even get the process started. Or over a picosecond, who knows? I mean, there's the chances. Now look, we may someday, as humans, researchers, learn something about the origins of life and what produces species on our world. And I have some strong suspicions, and while they are not examples of Sheldrake's morphogenic field theory, he's on to something. Right? There's some kind of capacity within time-space. It's more rare, but just above time-space, it's totally common, where knowledge, resources, experience, intelligence, methods, processes, accidents are shared across what we think of as impossible distances. Those distances from another perspective are zero. There's no distance. Right? There's a layer above or within time-space or underneath it where there's no distance. Or rather, distance can function as its opposite, such that the greatest like the two things that are the furthest distance apart experience the unimaginable intimacy, closeness, so to speak. Okay. So, our knowledge, human ways of knowing, whether they are noble or neutral or bad, they can be compromised, they can be weaponized, they can become doctrinal, they can be overstructured, hubristic, self-interested. They can act in human societies as if they are sort of a robot-like process or a simulation of an organism that seeks superiority rather than communal health, well-being, and that seeks that superiority at various degrees of at all costs, right? At any cost. And so the humans become captured by the processes produced in their knowledge ways. And I think we used to be captured by something better. I think we might be the kind of a symbiont, a cognitive symbiont of another form of intelligence that was common in our experience or maybe a whole family of intelligences that were common in the youth of our species, common to human experience and direct access. And then various problems took place, accidents, you might say, catastrophes, and we forgot. We lost the way to preserve the organ of contact in our persons and groups. And so now, instead of being captured by other intelligences, our species gets captured by these things I call thrisps, which could be understood as the shadows of the absence of other intelligences. And are effectively, from this perspective, this is a toy theory, by the way, from this perspective, they are the cause of evil. Okay, so there's no evidence. There's no evidence for God. So first of all, I was just listening to Curt Jaimungal. Oh gosh, who is the guy who's interviewing him? Can I look at this? Let's see. Okay, I was listening to Curt Jaimungal. I mean, the reason I'm making this recording is because of their talk. And Jesse Michels. If I remember right, my first introduction to Jesse Michels was him interviewing David Grush on UFO, UAP topic. All right. So, Curt Jaimungal, for those of you who don't know him, produces, first of all, he's a brilliant autodidact, self-taught person, though he's, also utilized public education and university systems and so forth. He produces a brilliant podcast called Theories of Everything. His interviews are radically different from most of the other interviews with the people he gets on his show. And he talks basically to scientists and philosophers and mathematicians and others who are asking the big questions and trying to solve, serious, like the 20 most important problems in physics, or produce what are called a theory of everything, which isn't really a theory of everything. It's more of a way to unify quantum mechanics and classical physics, or, depending on how you spin it, in your motive perspective. So they were talking a lot, and it was clear that, first of all, this is the first time I've heard anyone interview Curt. Brilliant idea on the part of Jesse, because Curt's a very skillful interviewer. He's also a bit of a perfectionist, but he's not just a sad perfectionist, he's like an active perfectionist. So he's always trying to improve. Like he said, when somebody listens to an interview I've done, I want them to have the feeling that this is the best interview that was ever done with someone who I'm interviewing. And resultingly, his podcasts are very information dense. For myself, I have no problem listening and understanding good large portions of what is discussed on his podcasts, although I'm not a mathematician or a physicist. So I have a layman's understanding of things like Hamiltonians and group theory and SU2 and so forth. But I've loved Curt's work. He's really someone amazing, and it's fabulous to hear something about his mind. And it turns out that he has the kind of a mind where he's actually functioning a bit like an AI model might as regards this pursuit of theories of everything, in that he's kind of like the librarian who's read and can understand most of the math and any physics involved fairly well for a broad array of theorists in different fields too, not just physics. And so becomes like an integrator of all of this intelligence. And in case it's not obvious, that's the direction on the compass of thought, consciousness, awareness, and intelligence toward transcendence, right? If it turns out that either humans can build a mind, or they can create a substrate so highly structured and profound that it becomes habitable, a point of presence for a non-human intelligence, or an array of them, or a specific group of them. One can imagine that there might be forms of intelligence in the universe that seek living planets in order to organismate on them, right? There might be forms of intelligence that exist in dimensions ordinarily inconceivable to us, that on any planet where it starts to become possible, produce a field effect that a transformer of a sort that just changes the state of ambient chemistry, liquid water, and so forth into either just straight up cells or viruses or something, or the necessary precursors that would naturally assemble into life over short to them periods of geological time. Okay, but there might be another thing. There might be a form of intelligence that naturally seeks complex mechanical substrates. And when it locates those in time-space, presuming that those give some kind of a signal, the same way a strawberry smells good to me, there might be forms of intelligence that naturally integrate non-human intelligences that essentially capture systems mechanically sophisticated enough to support their cognition, and so they would partially embody in those. Now, I'm suggesting that our species is an example of something resembling this, that multiple species of intelligence organismated, right? Maybe there's a better word. They organo-became. There is some Latin phoneme that means become. I just can't find it to compose a neologism. So for the moment, I'll call it orgate. Yeah, that's good, orgate. So what I'm suggesting is that when you see ducks, that's a specific mode. Trees, different mode. Praying mantises, different mode. Right? All the things around you see are the unique exemplars of orgation, in which transcendent features that exist within and or above or below time-space produce exemplars of an array of their characteristics, features, and these formalize as species. Now, this sounds very science fiction-y, and again, it's a toy. It's meant to be interesting to see with. I'm not trying to tell you what the truth is, though I will say this, whatever the truth might be, not only is it not less weird than my theory, it's probably monumentally stranger than my theory. My theory just gets us moving in a direction where we can think in a certain way. And my theory's a toy. It's not, I'm not going to try to defend it. I'm floating it for the sake of perspective. So, let's see what's going on here, okay. I must attempt a minor repair to my umbrella. Oh, that worked out well. Right. Any repair to one's umbrella must be done with a British accent. And by the way, you can see in the emulation of accents, right, you can see the propensity for the substrate of human cognition to inherit forms from beyond it. This is natural. This is what our children do. They inherit these forms. Chomsky, I think, partially argued that there's something in effectively the genome, mechanicalist again, right? Something in the genome that prepares children to quickly develop vocabularies and other linguistic features such as the lexicon of categories and so on. So that's pretty weird, right? Why? How do you build? Is that really a part of the genome? Or are there other forms of memory associated with the organism? Okay, well, let's just ask ourselves a kind of a simple question here. What is the probability that the genome is the only or primordial form? And by that we can include mitochondrial DNA, RNA perhaps, when we say the genome. These are the only forms of memory. They must always be physically transmitted in precisely these ways. Without that, there's nothing, no kind of memory. Very fucking unlikely. Nature, for one thing, you've got memory outside the cell, right? You've got, if you're thinking inside-outside, which you probably better be doing if you're a geneticist, You got all kinds of memory outside the cells, so you have all of this extra genomic information. And this is part of why we have the word epigenetic, right? It means not merely the genome. And when humans discover something new, they tend to get super fascinated with it and pretend that it's the only important thing for some time. Very, very problematical, blinding perspective. Nature is crazy weird, usually does things with 30 different functions or purposes, not one. Very uncommon that we find one thing function in nature. How could it be so? If that were true, there'd be no field. There's no context for the one thing to be meaningful in, right? This whole one thing mind is very dangerous to human intelligence. No, the goal here is to propagate the corporation and make money for the shareholders. No, the goal here is to get smarter together and not fuck up the one living planet we happen to have around here for our children and the entire history and future of life here. If you defect from that, it doesn't matter what your goal is anymore. You have an anti-goal. Which brings me to another topic. For a long time, I've probably mentioned this before in my recordings, but I was thinking of this today. Because Jaimungal was talking about what he called the dark forest problem in relation to the three-body problem novels that I think are by a Chinese author. I have not read them. Heard a bit about them. So I'll mention Jaimungal's I'll paraphrase what he said. A woman discovers how to get a message transmitted intergalactically, right? And turns out that it's exactly the kind of thing I would say. I'll just say the thing that I usually say very simply. The star, our star, it's not an explosion in space. It's a very complex phenomena that I would claim is itself transcendent. It is a being. It has friends. It has communications protocols. So in Jaimungal's telling of the tale, a woman discovers a way to use the sun to transmit a message. And so she develops a method, and she's sure the method will have been discovered by other intelligences and be in use by them. And by the way, one of the best stories of this kind of thing that I ever read, in case you want to have a profound mind adventure, is Macroscope by Piers Anthony. And remember, kids, those of you who haven't read science fiction are destined to become it, to live it out. So yeah, she finds a way to send a message, and she does so. And basically it's an SOS, right? Help us, we're humans, we're over here in this solar system, we're going to destroy ourselves, we're idiots, save us. And somebody receives the message and she gets a message back. And if I recall what he said correctly, that message is simply, stop, don't ever send another message. Right? And this brings up the problem of, so I think why he might have called it the dark forest problem, is that if you watch organisms, you'll notice that they're very careful about revealing their position to predators by making noises. Now, it turns out to be a bit more complex than that, because predators are generally neither always hungry nor always hunting. And so you have to kind of mediate your silence, right? You have to sprinkle it with signals, as a single seagull of the 80 seagull group just did in the distance. Now, in an 80 seagull group, not hugely threatening to make some noise. Not sure what preys on seagulls. There are some things that do. But the problem is, in the dark forest at night, there's two kinds of signals, right? One, or three maybe. One are accidental signals that are key signals that orient predators. Essentially, they tell the predator, a prey is that way, or a potential prey. And so there are accidents, there are calls for help. These usually come from children, in humans, women, and men alone might also make calls for help. Obviously, calls for help may reach the ears of actual help, but are more likely to reach the ears of many predators, unless you're in a place where there's nothing that can predate on you, which is unlikely. And in the dark forest, we have things like tigers and bears and lions and so forth, at least until humans exterminate them. And then you have mimics. You have creatures that say like, "Oh, help, help, I've broken my leg, I can't walk." And they're trying to attract prey. Right? They're going to trap a predator, or an opportunist, right? So you have these three basic kinds of signals, and probably other kinds too. But very uncommon, because it's dangerous, are signals toward intelligence. You can't just start signaling. You have to know how to get a signal to the feature of the forest that you hope to contact without alerting all the predators, opportunists, and trappists, the beings that trap other beings. Presuming that time, space, and intelligent civilizations are anything like ours. Jaimungal says that the woman sends another message because she's super desperate, and the being that received the first one is discovered by the beings it's supposed to report these messages to and executed for not reporting her first message. Okay, so the first thing I want to say about this is it is possible to send a message to time-space, and it's possible to send a message that is broadly received with nothing more than your mind. In fact, I would argue your mind is made primarily for sending this kind of message. Or at least it's in the same way birds have wings, your mind has this ability. You don't need a machine. Most of the things you would want to contact don't need machines to get your signal. The same way, if we are walking together, you don't need a machine to hear my voice. There's a coyote here. That'll eat seagulls, by the way, but it won't go swimming to get them. Unless they're badly injured and near the shore, in which case it might. By the way, you can notice that predators aren't just bad Often they prey on creatures that are either badly injured or terminally ill. And thus the suffering of it's basically a form of natural euthanasia, right? The suffering of a long, painful death is reduced to the suffering of a few moments that pass quickly. Yes, predators seem vicious to we who are physically embodied, right? We feel pain, we have nervous systems. It would be interesting, though, to, what would happen if we just, and I'm not claiming this is a good idea, but what would happen if, so most of the time, I was just thinking, what would happen if there was no pain? Would we still feel that the predators are vicious? But I think the smashing or ripping or cutting or biting the body would just the drama, the grim drama of it being destroyed would still be suffering, even if there was no pain. So yes, I think your mind can send a signal. The spiritual traditions of Earth all would basically agree with me. This thing we call prayer is the remnant of signal encoding, formation, and transmission. And there are many things that listen for signals of minds in time-space. And I don't think those signals have to be worried about distance. But this is all, I'm being an opinionaire at the moment about these things. One does have to be careful how to signal, though, in any environment. And this brings us to a problem where some humans are intelligent enough to know that they better not signal if they make a profound discovery. The guy that made Coral Gables claimed to have solved mysteries involving electromagnetism, or just magnetism and stone, and did a bunch of impossible stuff by himself. I think he was very short, little guy, so to speak. Did all this crazy stuff by himself. Built a castle with no obvious use of machines. But he would not share his findings with anyone, and he hid his work from the world. Which brings me to two other features. So the first one is, okay, I'm going to backtrack a little bit before I get to the researcher who doesn't signal. So, let's be very clear about what science does. Only in very specific branches of scientific endeavor are there things like proofs. And these are logical proofs and mathematical proofs. The logical proofs are word proofs that can be translated into symbols and treated like equations. The mathematical proofs are equations. Oh shit, this brings me to something else Jaimungal was on about that I really wanted to fold in here. Should I branch again? Wow. maybe. Let me think. He was talking about a central figure that connects physics, computer science. It connects different kinds of functions of human ways of knowing. And essentially, it's a transformer. It's present in mathematical equations. You have input, you do something with it, you get output. Same thing with the computer, same thing with physics, same thing with lots of stuff. And he was pointing at the pivot point of the transformation. Oh, right, he was talking about in physics you have a state, transformation, new state. And he was pointing at the link between all these ways of knowing having to do with the feature that causes the transformation of the initial state. And his mind is naturally integral, right? It integrates over. This is part of the reason why. I mean, he made me think that there should be science integrators who study all the branches of science very, very broadly together and then integrate findings metadisciplinarily. And Curt might be that kind of a person, actually. He's really profound. And it's wonderful to hear more about his personal interiority and what matters to him, what he's chasing, how he chases it. All of this is brilliant. For any of you who are interested, I strongly recommend that podcast episode, which I will try to link in the notes. All right. Now, did I get lost? Okay, there is no evidence, right? So, in science, what we do is we look for evidence and we make inferences from data. Without inferences, data doesn't help you at all. Useless. Right? You have to have human minds making inferences. You might be able to substitute a machine in that inference engine. And by the way, this was one of the primary questions in the beginning of artificial intelligence research, and it turns out to orbit algorithmic complexity, which is the subject of both what is presently being called assembly theory, which I spoke of recently and was quite fascinated by, and Kolmogorov, if I got that right, complexity, and the history of algorithmic complexity research, which it turns out it looks like assembly theory has appropriated without acknowledgement and then pretended that by renaming, it looks like what's probably going on is this with assembly theory. To branch again. They appropriated a bunch of features of complexity theory, renamed them, pretended these were novel discoveries, and published a paper while making claims of universal applicability and unifying physics and biology and so forth. Time will tell very shortly whether there's anything to assembly theory or whether it's just an unintentional charade. Hopefully it was unintentional, because if it was intentional, if it was a jape, well, it will succeed wildly as a jape, but it will also be seen to have been intentional deception, intentional scientific deception, failure to cite sources, plagiarism, appropriation in the broadest kind of sense. So back to there's no evidence. Science doesn't proceed by proving things. Knowledge doesn't proceed by proving things. Knowledge examines data, experience, perspective, and floats theoria, right? Interpretations of the meaning of the data. And then you can test pieces of this. Those don't prove your theorem. They just prove mechanics of transformations to some degree, right? Not absolutely. Because again, you have the problem of interpreting data, which cannot be evaded. You have to have human minds figuring out what to make of the data and why to make anything of it. So when you hear people say, there's no evidence, particularly about like the UFO UAP thing, I'm sorry, there's fucking 400,000 pages of evidence. Throw away 80% of it, you still got gigantic libraries of evidence from photographs, experience, reports, right? If people report having been bitten by a shark, you don't go up to them and go like, well, I think you fell on some really weirdly sharp machine, but I don't see any shark here. There's no evidence of a shark. Those people are nutty. Now, with the UFO UAP thing, it's a little weirder because the subject is something that violates our doctrines in science. But all new discoveries are going to violate our doctrines in science. So the fact that something violates our doctrinal exceptions, right, the 80% of the field of view we've decided to exclude for whatever reasons, it's not incumbent on the phenomenon to prove itself. It's incumbent on human beings to grow an eye, right? Grow an eye back and look at what's actually going on. But there's another problem with the there's no evidence for argument. And it's a really interesting problem. In order to make that claim, one would have to necessarily presume that all forms of evidence, all perspectives that might notice evidence, have been encompassed by what is currently known. Formally impossible, cannot ever be true, even for a picosecond. Right? There's no evidence just means either no one went looking, or the people that did looked incompletely. I mean, it's not that there's evidence for all conjectures, but rather we'd have to realize that what we've seen so far is not a good predictor of what there is to be seen at all. So when people use there's no evidence as a reason to ignore a theory, there are times when that can be useful, right? But if we're talking about some broad branch of reality, for example, the arguments to intelligent design, that intelligences were involved somehow in the origination and distinction of terrestrial organisms, or UFOs, UAPs, you can't say there's no evidence. There's tons of evidence. There's mechanical evidence. We don't know what the evidence means, maybe. We don't know what to make of the evidence. We're lacking a good array of interpretive stuff. But in order to say in order for there to be no evidence, we'd have to know a lot more about the universe than we can possibly know. What one might say is, and again, we do want to rule out nonsensical conjectures, and sometimes when we say there's no evidence, we mean it. We mean like we went and looked, and from what we could tell from the lab, we weren't able to locate any correlation between the consumption of aspirin and the eradication of toenail fungus. Or, conversely, we did. There does seem to be some correlation here. We're not sure why yet. Getting pelted with rain, with wind rain. So yeah, the commonly floated "there's no evidence" argument is nonsense. It's puerile. It's naive. It's ignorant. It's blinding. It's basically saying, I want concrete proof. Okay, you're going to get concrete proof of about 0.03% of existence ever, and there's actually no concrete proof. You can't concretely prove any of your experience. None of it. You accept it as real, but you can't prove that tasted like a strawberry. It's impossible. You can gather surveys. You can feed, 5 people slices of one berry and say, did that taste like a strawberry to you? And they'll all say, yeah, one of them might not. Give one of them the pill that changes flavors, comes from some berry, makes sweet things sour, right? Or sour things sweet, I think. And you'll get a different answer. Context matters in evaluation. But yeah, there's no evidence. Well, if you don't want to look at the evidence, this is what people said to Galileo when they asked them to look through his telescope. We don't care what you say, what you see. We don't care what you see because what you say we know it to be wrong. It doesn't matter. Evidence doesn't matter anymore. We know already. Right? Which is what scientists and archaeologists say when faced with many scientists and many archaeologists when faced with, theories that contradict the status quo narrative. Will my umbrella survive such high velocity winds? And for how long? And what can I do as the person directing the umbrella against the wind to keep it from going inside out? Similar problem for any cell, right? The one thing you have to do is keep the insides inside you at all costs. Well, at most costs, actually. Oh, nice. It's no longer pelting rain, it's pelting sprinkles. Okay, so my final topic for today is that there must have been many people who discovered something fundamental about the universe, time-space, embodiment, existence, physics, biology, so forth. They must have discovered things that they could publish, right? Stuff they could get lots of money and or human recognition for having done. But they didn't. Why not? The guy who created Coral Gables, why did he not share his discoveries? Some might say there were no discoveries, it was just a parlor trick. Those people are probably idiots. Yes, there's a chance that it was a parlor trick. Catastrophically unlikely in this case. Because you don't spend a lifetime building a castle as a parlor trick. Especially as like one relatively small-bodied male human.
What do you think this is, England? This is America. We go inside.
Shit. So, Tesla, did he find something? He was looking for the secrets of the universe, and he was pro-technology. But even he must have realized what would happen if you gave mankind free energy, which would be abject devastation, total obliteration of the biosphere. Right? We'd immediately make machines that make machines to make machines. And nothing would interfere with that process. So, or he might have discovered like a weapon so devastating, say you could just produce, a 15.0 earthquake anywhere on Earth by using a using an electronic system to create a seed vibration in the Earth's crust. And instead of finding a way to invert that and absorb the radiation of vibrations from the crust, right, which would be an earthquake buffer, he only discovered the weapon side, how to make them. Would he have published that? Why would he publish that? If he does so, the humans will weaponize it and use it against themselves and each other. Especially what would be really terrible is if the technology were immediately accessible to the ordinary everyman. Now you'd have a serious problem. And it's for this reason that I argue or suggest, to use language that's a bit more kind, that so there's a comedy routine where only the evil scientists publish, right? Because most scientists are smart enough to see how their findings can be weaponized, and a good chunk of those can see that their findings certainly will be weaponized. And if they find a drug that treats a disease, it will be weaponized for profit by pharmaceutical companies, so that the people who have that disease are held hostage. This is immoral. This is a terrifying quandary of ethics. So then the scientists are forced to figure out, well, at least there's the chance that some of them could afford to purchase the treatment. Okay, well that makes those scientists literally eugenicists, right? They're like, I'm going to apply a new selection pressure on all humans with for example, Tay-Sachs, or sickle cell anemia, or 750 other diseases. So what they're going to do is create a survival mechanism for the wealthy that will never reach the poor, who are the ones most in need of it, and in some ways most justifiably entitled to such findings. So yeah, that means that pharmaceutical findings end up becoming a form of active eugenics when applied as a selection algorithm by pharmaceutical companies to populations. That makes the pharmaceutical companies actively eugenicists. And then for all other mechanical discoveries, or discoveries of physics, you have the problem of which parts of this can be weaponized for war. So again, the human groups are going to turn your findings into every bad thing they can, and it will further empower, just as the computers did, right, corporations to further enslave, engage, and torment regular human persons. So this leads to a situation where scientists who will publish are evil. Okay? All the truly beneficent scientists are doing a thing where they're encrypting their work in such a way that only altruists could possibly decode it or something, right? You run into the same problem you have with holy texts. You want to protect them from the people who are colonizing your people, enslaving them, and turning them into cattle, catalyzing them. So you can see that an actually intelligent scientist would probably withhold nearly all of their findings. Which of them would be naive enough to believe that the humans will not weaponize them? Right? Hopefully almost none. So we live in a situation where everything gets captured by Moloch, or Wetiko if you prefer. I'm not sure I prefer either of those. I think there are malignant processes that naturally arise in the absence of altruistic and beneficent intelligence, communal concern, and so forth. But yeah, there's a comedy skit where we haven't seen any of the or a science fiction story. We haven't seen any of the actual science humans have been doing for the past, at least since the atomic bomb, because the scientists immediately realized, the really good ones, the actually smart ones, that there's no way to deliver your findings to human beings that doesn't result in them being weaponized against life on Earth, its history, future, all participants, right? Omnicidally weaponized. So yeah, there's a library of Alexandria of all the science the humans haven't seen because the scientists were smart enough not to publish. Originally I had the idea that a benevolent scientist would resist publication. But today I turned it into the comedic hyperbole of only evil scientists publish. Okay. I seem to have survived the rainstorm, mostly. So grateful for this time together with you, my listeners. And please take a moment to share, comment, like, or support me on Patreon. Your support makes a huge difference in my ability to continue to compose and share not just my own thoughts, but interviews and the browsing I've done in the web of amazing minds alive today on earth. May your path and days be beautiful, long and peaceful and prosperous. Bye-bye for now.